If you've ever wondered why short takeoffs like backcountry takeoffs or STOL competition takeoffs are performed the way they are, like really thought about the science behind it, then you've just clicked on the right video. It might seem logical, but there are a few things that are not as it seems. And by understanding the dynamics that we'll cover in this video, you'll most likely be able to shave off a few feet off of your shortest takeoff. What's up everyone, I'm a private pilot and aviation enthusiast, and this is Let's Go Aviate. There are three important concepts of the short takeoff that needs to be understood. The first concept we'll cover is something that is essential to understand why pilots are taking off the way that they are, which is the direction of thrust produced by the propeller. For an airplane to take off as short as possible, it needs to reach takeoff airspeed as quickly as possible. Therefore, it needs to accelerate forward as fast as possible. Thrust is what accelerates an airplane forward and is produced by the engine turning a propeller. The thrust a turning propeller produces are perpendicular to the blades of the propeller. Thus, for an airplane to have maximum acceleration, thrust needs to be applied parallel to the runway in this direction, not in this or any other direction. The bigger the angle between the thrust of the propeller and the runway, the less resultant forward thrust remains. Understanding that will make it clear why the tail of taildragger airplanes are lifted up to horizontal while accelerating on the takeoff roll. If you want to calculate the resultant forward thrust at an angle, the following formula can be used. F is force, which in this case is thrust. Theta is the angle at which the force is being applied. At 0 degrees, all thrust are pushing the airplane forward parallel to the runway. If the angle of thrust is, say, 30 degrees off parallel, the resultant forward thrust is only about 87% of the total thrust produced. This effectively wastes thrust and thus decreases acceleration and increases takeoff distance. So you can imagine that for a taildragger with all three wheels on the ground, depending on the specific airplane's deck angle, you effectively lose about 10% of thrust until the tail is lifted up to horizontal. And clearly, the quicker we can get the tail up, the shorter the takeoff distance will be. This is also the reason why nosewheel airplanes, which usually have a deck angle of close to 0 degrees, always have shorter takeoff distances than taildraggers, obviously assuming the airplanes are identical. There is an exception in the case of taildraggers with enough power and elevator authority to lift the tail with power with the brakes applied before it starts moving, and once it starts moving, keeping the tail from falling down. It will, however, induce more drag because of the deflected elevator to keep the tail from coming down, which in this case, in theory, means the taildragger's takeoff distance will be ever so slightly longer. So now that we know that to take off as short as possible, we need to lift the tail as soon as possible, and we can all take off to the max of our airplane's ability, right? Well, no. Because once the tail is lifted up to horizontal, we cannot take off because the angle of attack of the wings is 0 or close to 0, and little or no lift is being produced by the wings. Thus, we need to lower the tail back down, or in aviation terms, rotate, to create a positive angle of attack on the wings to produce lift to take off. In order to take off as short as possible, the angle of attack on the wings needs to be as high as possible, and on a taildragger that is achieved by lowering the tail wheel until it touches the ground. On a taildragger, that is the maximum angle of attack that can be created by the wings whilst all three wheels are on the ground. But the most important factor here is the timing of rotation. Rotate too soon or too late, and you increase your takeoff distance. Here's why. If you rotate too soon, the airspeed required to produce lift at that angle of attack is insufficient for takeoff until it accelerates enough to produce sufficient lift. This can be a few seconds or even milliseconds, but it increases takeoff distance for two reasons. When the tail is lowered back towards the ground on the takeoff roll, more drag is produced by a bigger area that now has to move through the air. Instead of the wings slicing through the air along its thinnest edge like a sharp knife cuts through butter, a much larger area now moves through the air, similar to trying to slice through butter with the blunt side of a knife. This counts for the wings, the tailplane, as well as to a lesser extent the fuselage. But that's not the end of it. Remember at the beginning we said the tail needs to be raised as soon as possible, because with the tail down, the forward component of the thrust being produced by the propeller is only about 90% of the total thrust being produced. So those two factors combine to result in a noticeable increase in takeoff distance if the airplane is rotated too soon. Rotate too late and it will obviously use more runway. So the idea is to rotate at exactly the right moment, not too soon and not too late. To judge if you or someone else is taking off as short as that airplane will allow is by watching the main wheels closely as they lift off. If they lift off at exactly the same moment the tail wheel touches the ground upon rotation, it is the shortest takeoff possible. If the tail wheel touches the ground and the main wheels don't immediately lift off, you've rotated too soon and you will have a longer takeoff distance. If the main wheels lift off before the tail will touch the ground, you've rotated too late. There is no magical way to determine your perfect rotation timing other than practicing until you get the timing 100%. So now you can go and watch your favorite STOL competition and tell who does and who doesn't use their airplane to its full potential. So what about nose-wheeled airplanes?
Let's not go there.
No.
Having the perfect rotation timing is potentially even more important on a trike than on a taildragger. Firstly, same as a taildragger, rotating too soon increases drag and reduces forward thrust, meaning increased takeoff distance. And rotating too late means using more runway than is required. But additionally, compared to a taildragger for which the deck angle is less than or close to the critical angle of attack, meaning the angle of the wing when all three wheels are on the ground, usually places the wing at a good angle of attack for liftoff in the 3-point attitude. This prevents one from overcooking the rotation on a taildragger. On a nose-wheeled airplane, when over-rotating, the wing's angle of attack on some aircraft can easily exceed the critical angle of attack, meaning not only a lot more drag on the takeoff roll, but the plane can take off with the majority of the wing in stalled condition. This means there is much more room for error on a trike than on a taildragger. Additionally, on a trike, it's a little bit harder to determine from video footage if you are taking off as short as possible. On a taildragger, the angle of attack can only go as much as the deck angle allows. But on a nose wheel, it's a little bit more of a guessing game to determine if you should rotate sooner or later, or rotate more or rotate less. However, if after rotating the main wheels doesn't immediately get airborne, assuming the rotation angle was large enough, it's safe to say the rotation was too soon. It's harder to determine if the rotation is too late on a trike because of no accurate way to guess the wing's angle of attack. But if the airplane gets airborne before the full rotation is complete, then the airplane was rotated too late. Very important. I talked about the shortest possible takeoff for a taildragger being achieved by lifting the tail as soon as possible and rotating at the perfect time. While that is true, there is another factor that can shorten or even lengthen your takeoff roll, and that is the strategic use of flaps. We've talked about the maximum angle of attack being the maximum amount of lift the wings can create. But the wing's lift can be further increased by using flaps. However, flaps not only increases lift, but also increases drag. This is generally where misuse can result in longer takeoff distances. To make use of the extra lift created by the flaps but negate the additional drag, what most pilots do is start the takeoff roll with 0 flaps and at the last moment when rotating, applying full flaps. In theory, that is the best way to do it, assuming you get the timing of rotation as well as the timing of flaps application perfect. However, this is not the most effective short takeoff technique on all aircraft types, and here's why. On an airplane like the Super Cup with big plane flaps, there are 2 important factors to take into consideration. Firstly, the flaps are quite large and create a lot of drag when they are lowered. Secondly, the application of flaps in flight lowers the tail or raises the nose, if you will. This might not be true for all airplane types with plane flaps, but should be for most. But what does this have to do with short takeoff technique though? Remember earlier we said that to take off as short as possible, the tail needs to be lifted as soon as possible to reduce drag and make use of full forward thrust. So if you were to select full flaps right from the start of the takeoff roll, the tail will take longer to rise. This, in combination with the additional drag that full flaps produce, will slightly lengthen your takeoff roll. Therefore, the shortest way to take off is to start with 0 flaps and only add flaps when rotating. However, this won't work on some other popular aircraft types like the Takeoffs. The Takeoffs has Junkers style flaperons, which isn't technically part of the airplane's wing, but is a separate wing mounted below the airplane's main wing. The result of this is that when taking flaps in flight, it raises the tail or lowers the nose. This is a very pronounced effect and is the opposite effect of plane flaps. So in a Takeoffs, when starting the takeoff roll with 0 flaps, the tail will take longer to rise. We've already established that to take off as quickly as possible, the tail needs to be lifted as soon as possible. This will not only result in a slightly longer takeoff roll, but adding flaps upon rotation will raise the tail when you are trying to lower the tail for rotation, which is completely counterproductive. So instead, by applying full flaps even before starting the takeoff roll, the tail actually lifts quicker, getting full forward thrust and getting rid of unnecessary wing and tailplane drag sooner. You might ask, what about the drag produced by going full flaps right from the start? Firstly, these flaps are not very wide when compared to plane flaps and do not create nearly as much drag. In fact, they create so little drag, many of these planes can take off and even sustain a climb on full flaps. In turn, due to their low drag, their weakness is that they don't very effectively slow down a plane for short landings, but that is a topic for a different video. Secondly, apart from being very small flaps in the short takeoff roll, we accelerate from 0 to 40 miles per hour, being at 40 only for a few milliseconds before we get airborne. Drag increases with increasing speed, and at only 40 miles per hour, there really isn't a lot of drag. I'd argue that the fact that the usage of flaps helps lift the tail sooner completely negates the effect of additional drag. One thing we have not yet touched on in the video is headwind component. The stronger the headwind component, the shorter the takeoff distance. And when the headwind component gets very strong, like upwards of 15 knots, some of these extreme STOL type planes will take off in only a few feet, especially those high horsepower, great power to weight ratioed planes. In many of these situations, raising the tail at all on the takeoff roll is completely unnecessary because it takes longer to lower the tail than it takes to reach takeoff speed. Remember, if the main wheels lift off on the rotation before the tail wheel touches the ground, the rotation was too late. And in these windy situations on these high power to weight ratioed airplanes, the only way to get the tail down quicker is by just leaving it down all the way from the start. In such a case, just taking off in the 3-point attitude will not only result in shorter takeoffs, but will result in more consistent takeoff distances because of the much lighter workload. Yeah, I realize that taking off in a 3-point attitude is boring and not very cool. but we are not here to look cool, we are here to take off short.
The two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive.
The final thing that severely affects takeoff distance is aircraft weight. And yeah, it's fairly obvious, but it is so often overlooked. To be more precise, it's actually all about power to weight ratio, or to be more scientifically correct, thrust to weight ratio. However, wing volume also plays a role. The bigger, the better. But that assumes all wings are equally efficient at slow airspeed, which they are not. So yeah, it gets complicated. None of that is changeable on the fly.
Pun intended?
No pun intended.
Except weight. Takeoff distance in any airplane is directly proportional to airplane weight. The lower the weight, the shorter the takeoff distance. By keeping the weight as low as possible will ensure the takeoff distance will remain as short as possible. That is pretty much it. I'd love to know your thoughts on the subject, so let me know by leaving a comment below. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.